Welcome and thanks for listening in to the RWTA's latest podcast, the UK Cold Chain in 2020, Brexit, COVID and Vaccine. My name is Executive Officer of the RWTA. Today I'm excited to speak with my counterpart and equivalent in the UK, Shane Brennan. Shane is the CEO of the Cold Chain Federation and leads the United Kingdom's temperature-controlled logistics industry. Hi Shane, and thank you for staying after hours. I'm very well, and yourself?
Yeah, I'm really good, really good. Good to speak.
And you to you as well. Thank you for staying after hours to speak with me.
That's fine. Well, you're up very, really early, so I think, we're both going above and beyond the working day to talk to each other.
Certainly not banking hours this end, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Although in the same industry, I wanted to ask you, you have some very different circumstances that'll be affecting your country and the sector. So firstly, I wanted to ask you, with presently about 20,000 new cases of COVID in the last day or so in the UK, what sort of strain is that putting on the cold chain?
So it's been a very strange year, as you know. I mean, we'll all remember 2020, won't we? The key thing right now is so we got through the first wave in March and April, and that was a particularly kind of dramatic period with significant amounts of demand, pressure in the train. We all saw the toilet roll rush, and that fed through into frozen and chilled food. And then there was quite a rush to work out how to operate in terms of safe operating procedures and working and whatever else. And we were very busy in that window trying to help members to understand what to do. But, being logistics people, they sorted it out quite quickly, and we had some pretty robust ways of working in place pretty soon into sort of March. And then that's basically carried on. And so whilst we had that sort of very significant demand peak, particularly in the grocery side in the March-April window, we then saw the sort of falling off a cliff of demand in the hospitality sector as we actually locked and closed a lot of those premises down. That then pattern sort of carried on through the summer. Some recovery within hospitality, but quite a significant continued sort of demand on our services that people were able to meet. And then we've got the announcement in the last few weeks of a second lockdown in order to deal with the sort of second wave that's come about. And really, the sort of cold chain has coped with that one pretty well. It's taken it in its stride. Kind of the processes that we were working on, we've just continued. The demand is still stayed relatively good, comparatively speaking, in hospitality because of takeaways and the like. And we're hoping that it will end at the beginning of next month and we get on from there.
Okay, so with the lockdowns, as you call it at the moment, have you had empty shelves? Have you had any panic buying that has continued?
There was a little bit. So the trend has been sort of in the sort of it's been between 10 and 30% up throughout the period since the first lockdown compared to year on year. And we hit to sort of close to the sort of 30% mark at the start of the second lockdown. But what we didn't have was any real panic buying. I think what people learned from the first lockdown was the supply chain can cope. And actually there wasn't the same. And actually one of the dynamics of the first lockdown was people and their families arguing over who got to go to the shops. And I think people were looking forward to that, and they knew that the shops would be open and they get what they needed. So we haven't seen the same way. It's a very different feeling this time, the lockdown here, even though it's worrying. It's not the same as it was the first time. It's a lot more active.
How do you feel that people are actually feeling, with working from home? Although it's different, it's a second round of it, and we've has a lot of resentment, and people were very tired and they're pretty much over it by that stage. How do you feel that people were going in the UK?
Same. I think we're pretty tired. I think everyone's a bit exhausted, mentally exhausted with the sort of the rigors of the year. It is harder to sort of observe the lockdown. So the population is finding it harder to observe the lockdown in the way we did with the excitement and the novelties of March and April. And I think within the chain as well, I mean, people have been heroes throughout this, and they've continued working. They showed up for work. They've got the job done. But it wouldn't be human if it felt like it was a bit harder to keep that momentum and energy up through the second wave. So we are seeing a little bit more absenteeism, and we are seeing a little bit more difficulty in sort of resourcing. That said, of course, we have got sort of big job worries and job anxiety with sort of growing unemployment across the country. So actually, if you've got a job, you kind of want to keep it. So there's a kind of bit of a balance of those two things, I would say, playing out in the workforce.
I just realised the absenteeism has a whole new meaning, doesn't it? What do you do? Stay home?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're not really sort of taking time off to go and do something fun. You are sort of locked in at home. And I guess the biggest problem really is absenteeism is the fact of all the isolating, the test and trace. So if you come across somebody
Yes.
who has got COVID, or someone in your a kid in school, and their class gets sort of shut down because of it, that does create kind of knock-on effects on the absentee rate. And because we're testing so much more now, there's way more of that. Sort of at the present than there was the first time around. I mean, the biggest thing that we were surprised by in March and April was actually we were all predicting at the start of the wave that we thought we were going to get 25%-ish absentee rates in the cold chain. We never really got above 5, and I think
Wow.
people showed up for work, you know. So that's again, the credit they deserve for that.
Yeah, I think it's, when it's 2-3 times time Christmas, people realise that everybody's relying on everybody else. And so they don't want to be absent because there's just too much on, and it's kind of exciting in a strange sort of a way. There's a lot of adrenaline happening, that's for sure.
Definitely.
You touched on something that I wanted to talk to you about more. Tell me about Brexit and food shortages. So, although the UK holds strategic oil reserves equivalent to 90 days of net imports, I believe, strategic food stores are not seen as necessary, as the UK is seen to have a highly resilient food supply chain. Do you feel that the combination of COVID and Brexit could lead to food shortages in the UK?
You're right on it. This is something that's in our papers today. This is one of our leading commentators has been talking about this in the paper today, and I've been sort of responding to that. It's really interesting, this, isn't it? I mean, I think that I arrived at the Cold Chain Federation 2.5 years ago, and sort of my first week, I got a question from the journalist about whether we had enough space to stockpile, and it was stockpiling for Brexit then,
Yeah.
and it's still stockpiling, and I've been talking about stockpiling ever since. And the question really, it's a really kind of almost like a supply chain theory kind of question. To what extent do you maintain continuity of supply by holding a load of stuff in a warehouse to release in the event of there being some sort of crisis? And how much do you hold, and what sort of food do you hold, and where would you hold it? And if you then start releasing that, who do you release it to, and in what kind? It's the kind of command and control that suggests feels pretty distant from the kind of sophisticated supply chain that we rely on to service our different food markets today. It feels very from the 1940s, the way that's described. I mean, I see it as making sure there's enough capacity in the chain to keep stuff moving. I mean, that's the key. We all know that in supply and cold chain, the job is to keep product moving, and you need the right size of warehousing. You need the right capacity of vehicles in order to keep that flow from going. The biggest problem with Brexit is that it essentially it's a man-made, red tape-based impediment to that trade. And we've been used for the last 45 years to being one country to a large extent. I mean, it's the sort of thing you politically get shot for here, saying that kind of thing. But from an economic point of view, the EU has been one country for 40 years. And businesses have been built to reflect that. We don't tend to see UK and Ireland as two separate economies. They are effectively one economy. If you're a food producing business, you have a UK and Ireland director, you have a division, and you order your product. Some of it for the UK, some of it for Ireland, or you start some of it for Northern Ireland, some of it for Scotland. And having to sort of unpick all of that is really quite difficult. Equally, stuff moving through the border, literally, how many trucks, how long would it take for a truck to pass through the border posts in Calais or in Dover, which are the main strategic ports for moving goods in and out of the EU to the UK? If that gets delayed by, say, 5 minutes every truck, then we talk about that potentially leading to sort of 40, 50 miles worth of queues on the back of that sort of interruption in the chain. And that's the sort of thing that worries us, that slowdown in the capacity. So it's not necessarily about having lots of stuff in warehouses, but it is about having more time in the chain, maybe an additional day, an additional 2 days. It's something that we're going to take a lot of readjusting to get used to.
That sounds extraordinary. Adding to any sort of shortages that we've had here and multiplying it by the capacity that you have over there. One of the things that we were talking to the government in Australia about is, could you please tell people there are no shortages of food here? There is plenty of food. It's trying to get it there on time, and that supply-demand issue that is there, whereas yours is added to an economic.
Yeah, we're not doing ourselves any favours. Sorry, yeah, Marianne, we're not doing ourselves any favours. This is a bureaucratic there is no real bureaucratic or economic case for doing this, putting these kinds of barriers in place. It's all about the politics. And unfortunately and frustratingly, we've been talking about this for 4 years. That said, I back the supply chain to stay resilient. I back the supply chain not to have those shortages. And the thing that will cause those shortages is exactly the same thing that will cause the shortages in COVID. And that is unprecedented and large-scale consumer panic buying. Because, as your members will know, as my members know, there's not really a problem in getting product to consumers as long as they're not crazy buying it and you can't fill the shelves up as quickly as they can replenish them. Because that feeling of emptiness is the thing that creates the pressure. And the other thing is that, we've got a lot of smart people, whether they're in the retail business, whether they're in the logistics side, whether they're in the supplier side, and they've got a whole range of things they can do to kind of cope with that interruption. We can consume more of what we produce here in the UK. We can source from other markets that aren't the EU markets, because actually the supply chains for those won't be that massively interrupted by Brexit. And we can reformulate, and we can change, and we can buy different things. And these are all kind of strategies that are as important for Brexit preparations as sort of the kind of stockpiling or where inventory build up that comes with it. I guess my biggest worry, though, is back to that point about COVID. We've got a very tired workforce, mentally exhausted, having dealt with the restructuring and changes of COVID. We basically sort of wish somebody somewhere could go and sort of say, look, why don't we understand that this is a big picture thing. We understand this is about changing the nature of how we operate in the world, etc. But can we give it 6 months and get over the pandemic first, and then we'll deal with this later once we've got a bit of a rest. But unfortunately, the politics of it don't really seem to allow for that.
No, look, adding to that, in the last week or so, Shane, there's been talk of a vaccine available as early as March next year. Adding to disruption to do with COVID, add Brexit in, and now a vaccine, what sort of effect do you think that's going to have on the UK? And when I say what sort of effect, I mean mentally. How will the talk of a vaccine be accepted? And how do you think it's going to affect the way in which it's being transported, getting to people, and being effective?
So the vaccine is brilliant news, isn't it? I mean, it's just a light at the end of the tunnel, and the fact that there's more than one vaccine now that seems to be effective, and it looks like most of them are on track to being approved. And so that's been a real kind of positive light, and I think that will set a really good sort of tone for things. So I'm really pleased about that. Just not just in my role, but just as a dad, as a citizen of the UK, I'm really pleased the vaccine's on its way. I think that the other thing, of course, is that it adds to the real positive of this whole period. The thing that we sort of cling to is how much supply chain has been appreciated through the whole period. And the COVID vaccines, like the cherry on top. The fact that people are talking across the mainstream media, and I've been fielding inquiries from all of our major newspaper and broadcast TV outlets, asking me questions about how the cold chain works. It's just great for us. It really helps to sort of reinforce why we're so important. And sort of the different nuances of -70 versus -20, -+2 to +8 grade, and how the different supply chains work. I mean, I'll spend all my day telling people about that because it just helps. It helps to make people appreciate what we're all about.
I think I was grinning as you were talking then, because we have, with the board of RWTA and the industry, we've been discussing this entire time. Hasn't this been fantastic for the Australian cold chain as well, for exactly the same reason? Because we sit in between the retailers, whom everybody knows, and for those producers who are quite often in the news. We're the very quiet in-betweeners who never get seen, who nobody understands, including many politicians. I'm really thinking, okay, it wasn't just here as well. This is something internationally that we've got, I'm going to say in inverted commas, to thank COVID for, is finally we're on the map. Finally, we've been accepted and seen as an fantastic.
Totally, Marianne, I remember you and I talking very at the very outset of this back in March, talking about the situation, and we were pretty much in awe at the time of what our members were doing at that time. We were sort of reporting on what your members were doing in terms of reacting to the situation. And our members were, and we did I remember we did a podcast back then with some of the other leaders from other organisations we were talking back then. And I guess what our job, my job, and I think your job as well, has been to sort of make sure we're reinforcing that point to those politicians and the media, and we've got to make sure they keep remembering that in next month. And once it's all over and done with, and we're hopefully in back to normal, whatever normal will be in September, October next year, that people remember what the cold chain did during this year, and then we get the support we need for that.
Absolutely. And when if we take a snapshot between here we are in November, and this started in March, and I think that's when we started talking, and there was a lot of, the feeling around the place was very panicky, very unsure. We're kind of used to it now. I think everyone's settled into a pattern of, okay, nothing's normal anymore. So we just do what we need to do, get very pragmatic about it. What would you see as I'll call it the highlight. What would you see as one of the biggest points? You've mentioned that the cold chain has become recognised as an essential service. It's important. You've been talking to politicians, so the profile has jumped. Is there another point? Are there other things that you think have characterised this year as something special?
I think the other thing I'd point to is collaboration. The extent to which I've seen, whether it's logistics companies talking to their customers differently and sharing information and sort of saying, right, here's a shared problem. Let's work out how we're going to deal with it together and think differently about the moving out of that kind of customer sort of service provider kind of dynamic, which is a bit confrontational at times, and being much more collaborative, saying, look, we understand the problem. How are we going to solve it? But also cross collaboration between competitors within the cold chain as well. A real sense of pulling together, whether it's sharing vehicles, sharing intelligence, or sort of mixing work up. And I'm not saying that we should carry on in that vein forever. Competition is healthy and good, but that understanding that we've reached, that sense of pulling together, I think is the thing that stands out to me, and I will remember for sure.
That's probably that's the best point, I think, where people start to come together. It's not about competition anymore. It's about ensuring that people are served. And there's been an incredible response from, I think, it's not just yours, but it's certainly Australia as well, and I dare say all over the world, where people have collaborated and it's something pretty special. So, look, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Shane. Thanks for giving us the insight into the UK and how things are ticking along for the cold chain on the other side of the world during a very, very trying year. I suspect we will be doing regular updates in the year to come. Thanks to all who have taken the time to join us today, and I'd like you to keep an eye out for more vlogcasts from the RWTA soon. Thank you, Shane.
Thanks, Marianne. Thanks. It's great to talk.
And you too. Thank you.